Okay, to create a form to add a customer, first we need an action. This action should return a view that includes the form. So, in controllers, open up customers controller and add a new action. And we see action 4, tab. We call this new. Now view is red because we don't currently have this view. So right click and go to add view. Now untick create as a partial view and make sure the layout is selected here. Add. Now I'm going to change this title to new customer. Okay, to render a form, we're going to use a few HTML helper methods like action link that you have seen before. The first one is html.beginForm. Here we pass the name of the target action that should be called when we post this form. So let's say create action in customers controller. Now we don't have this action and that's why create is red. But we'll add that in a second, so don't worry about it. Now a form in HTML is like a container that we can add various elements in it. But this html.beginForm method just renders the beginning form tag. How do we render the closing tag? Well, this method returns a disposable object. So if we wrap this call in a using block like this, at the end of the using block, the object returned from html.beginForm will be disposed. And in the dispose method, it will simply render the closing HTML tag. Okay, so this is our form. Now there is a special markup that we need to follow to render modern and responsive forms. And this is the markup that Bootstrap understands. So we wrap each input field in a div with the class form-group. Now inside this div, we need two elements, a label and an input field. We can either write raw HTML here, like label, or we can use html.label4 method. And here we pass a lambda expression that specifies the name of the target property in the model used in this form. Well, we haven't set the model yet, so let's go to top of the view and use the model directive. The model for this view should be a customer. So customer. Now back here, we use the lambda expression. M as in model goes to m.name. So when Razor View Engine renders this view, it will look at this name property and use this as the value for our HTML label. Next, we need a text box. Again, we can use raw HTML or use html.textbox for m goes to m.name. Pretty simple. Now let's run the application and see what we get before we add more fields to this form. So Control F5. Okay, right click this field, inspect. Look at this input element. You see a bunch of attributes prefixed with data-val. For example, we've got data-val equals true, which means that we need validation for this field. We have another one, data-val-length, with a message saying the field name must be a string with a maximum length of 255 characters. Where is this coming from? Well, here's the definition of our customer class. Earlier, we applied two data annotations, required and string length, on the name property. So when you use the helper method textbox for ASP.NET MVC automatically supports validation for that field. In contrast, if you use raw HTML, you have to write all this by hand. Now back here, as the second argument to this method, we can pass an anonymous object. And any properties we add to this object will be rendered as HTML attributes. So if I want to give this element a class, I can type class here. Now you see there's an error here because class is a reserved keyword. So we need to prefix it with an @ sign. Now I'm going to give this the class form-control. This is one of the classes defined in Bootstrap that gives our input fields a modern look and feel. Let's save this view, back to the browser, refresh. Look, we get this nice hover effect and our text box looks a little bit chunky with round corners. So every input field we add to the form, we give it this form-control class. Now let's select this form group, duplicate it, and this time change the name to birth date. So that's the label. We should also change the property for the text box, birth date. Now select again, duplicate. This time I want to add a checkbox. So label for is subscribed to newsletter. And here, instead of using text box 4, I'm going to use checkbox 4. And change the property to is subscribed to newsletter. Save. Back to the browser. Refresh. Okay, we have this weird layout here. Because when rendering a checkbox, we need to follow a slightly different markup. Let's go to getbootstrap.com. Under CSS, scroll down. Here you can see forms. Scroll down. So this is a Bootstrap form, and here's the markup. If you scroll down a little bit more, this is the declaration of our checkbox, which is different from other fields. Because with other fields, we need to enclose them with a div with the class form-group, and inside each form group, we have a label and an input field. So I'm going to grab this markup for the checkbox, copy, back to Visual Studio, paste it here. So we have a div with the class checkbox. Inside this div, we have a label, and inside the label, we have our input field. Note that this input field does not have the class form-control. So I'm going to replace this with html.checkbox4. M goes to m.is subscribed to newsletter. And then instead of using html.label4, I manually type the label for this checkbox. So subscribe to a newsletter with a question mark. Now we can get rid of this form group. Save. Back to the browser. Refresh. Problem solved.